London, its people, the people who built it, in fact, all life on Earth are only here by chance. 99% of all the species that ever lived have been wiped out in a series of catastrophes, disasters that changed the course of evolution. 650 million years ago, the Earth froze. It pushed life to the verge of extinction. But if it hadn't, then life today would be little more than microscopic slime. This is the story of Snowball Earth. When we think about how we evolved from being single cells to what we are today, we tend to see it as a pretty calm process, don't we, with animals slowly transforming into other animals. But that's only part of the story. The reality is much more brutal and violent, with creatures hanging on for dear life while disaster after disaster threatens them with extinction. It's almost impossible to comprehend the immense time scale of our planet's lifetime. So imagine the whole of Earth's history compressed into a single day. Each minute represents around 3 million years. At midnight on our clock, 4.5 billion years ago, the planet was born. 2 minutes later, the first catastrophe struck. A protoplanet, Theia, smashed into the infant Earth. And in its wake, the first life appeared. By 8 a.m., there were shallow seas full of simple bacteria. Gradually, over the next 2 billion years, the planet stabilized, though life remained as single-celled organisms. Until 12.5 hours later, at 8:27 p.m., 650 million years ago, disaster struck again. The planet froze. Temperatures plummeted. Ice spread down from the poles. It encased the planet in a layer thousands of meters thick. A snowball Earth. Life had only just got started. Now it seemed doomed. There are no traces of these ancient ice sheets left. They're long gone. But there are still clues that can tell us about this dramatic ancient ice age. The evidence is hidden away in some of the world's most remote places. These are the Flinders Ranges in the Australian outback. Today, it's one of the hottest and driest places on Earth. But geologist Jim Gayling knows that the rocks here provide direct evidence of our planet's frozen past. The area is so vast, the best way to investigate is from the air. There's a disaster story written in these layers of rock. You just have to know how to read it.
It's really like looking at a book made of rock. Every single layer has a secret on it. We look at these rocks as though they're a history book.
With the help of aerial photographer Tim Beyer, they spot an unusual rock formation in a dried-up creek. It's the evidence Gayling's been looking for. A 650 million year old rock called a dropstone.
A dropstone is an exotic piece of rock. They shouldn't be mixed in with mud and sand. They should be together in boulder beds or gravel beds. But there they sit.
The rock may look insignificant, but it's a major clue to the powerful forces that created the frozen world of Snowball Earth.
This rock shouldn't be here. It's sitting in a rock composed of mud, silt, sand and gravel. And normally that's impossible. The whole lot now is one big rock.
There's only one force that can carry rocks like this around the globe, and that is ice. There's not a lot of ice in Australia today. So, to investigate how ice could have moved rocks around the world in the ancient past, glaciologist Shad O'Neill scales the sheer walls of the Matanuska Glacier in Alaska. It's the closest we can get to our distant icy past.
We're taking a look at the rocks that are being transported down the valley by the glacier. And to do that, we need to go down there.
Glaciers are nature's bulldozers. They smash everything in their path. They gouge stones and rocks from high up in the mountains and carry them down the valley.
Rocks as big as buses can be transported for miles across the landscape by a glacier. I mean, the longest glaciers are hundreds, if not thousands of kilometers long, so you can move rocks over long distances.
When the ice melts, it deposits debris at the base of the glacier. This glacier is only a few hundred meters thick, but it can still carry thousands of tons of rock.
The glacier brought all this stuff down from the mountains, and when the glacier melts away, it ends up looking like a building site that's been bulldozed.
The Matanuska Glacier transports rocks for over 24 miles. It's the same process that carried the ancient drop stones in the Flinders Ranges. But the glaciers of 650 million years ago carried them for thousands of miles.
Here's a great example of a rock that was picked up by the glacier, carried down valley, and then deposited. Very similar to what you'd find in Australia, where glaciers used to be in the past.
So the Australian outback was once covered in ice. But that doesn't prove the whole world was frozen over. The problem is that the Earth's surface is in constant, very slow motion, pushing the continents to different places. So it's possible that 650 million years ago, when the drop stones were deposited, Australia could have been much closer to the cold South Pole. Meaning the drop stones were carried by normal polar glaciers. The solution to this conundrum can be found in another desert. Death Valley in the American Southwest. The term Snowball Earth was coined by geologist Joe Kirschvink, who's been gathering evidence on the theory for the past 2 decades.
Death Valley has a series of rocks that are extremely important for understanding Earth history. It's a treasure chest.
Like the Flinders Ranges, it's not the kind of place you'd expect to find evidence of ice. But geologists have found dozens of glacial drop stones here.
Every time I come here, I see new things. There are those big boulders, and I see one at the bottom, and they're all drop stones. You can see that they're coming in from the top. This is one of the best places in the world to see this type of geology.
The drop stones Kirschvink has discovered here date back to the same period as those found in the outback. So this desert too was covered in ice. But the big advantage is that we know where Death Valley was 650 million years ago. Every rock has a unique magnetic signature. This allows scientists to determine the point on the globe where the rock was formed. To study this signal, Kirschvink drills cores from the rocks containing the dropstones and measures their magnetic field.
The Earth's magnetic field is formed by electric currents flowing in the middle of the planet. The pattern of that field allows us to measure the latitude that a rock forms at.
When a glacier dumped these dropstones here, Death Valley was inside the tropics. The results at the Flinders Ranges were even more dramatic.
A group started studying the magnetism in the Flinders Ranges, and they thought they had a very stable magnetization. That they said, well, wait a minute, something might be relevant there.
The rock's magnetic signal revealed that 650 million years ago, Australia was in a completely different place than today. When the whole continent was in the grip of a big freeze, Australia was near the equator. Here was proof the scientists were looking for.
It was wonderful. It was the first time anywhere that we had proven that the glaciers were on the equator.
Ice sheets along the equator, the world's warmest climate zone, meant only one thing.
If you have ice at the equator, then the whole of the globe must have been covered by ice. And so you have to envisage a completely white planet.
Scientists believe it was the greatest ice age in the history of the Earth.
The entire Earth would have looked like Antarctica looks today. Even areas as desolate like this in Death Valley with nothing on it would be under several hundred meters of ice. The whole planet indeed would be a snowball.
Under a thick crust of snow and ice, the simple microbial life developing in the oceans faced an uncertain future.
This was the greatest ice age that this planet has ever known. You have to imagine a planet whose oceans were not only capped by ice near the poles, but that ice had grown across the entire planet and all but shut down its living systems.
650 million years ago, life on Earth seemed destined for total extinction. Somehow, something had plunged the whole planet into a catastrophic deep freeze. The question was, what? "8:27 p.m. on our clock of the Earth's history, 650 million years ago. The planet faced climate disaster. A global deep freeze. But what made it happen? Snowball Earth wasn't the first time the Earth had frozen, and it wouldn't be the last. Our planet goes through an ice age about once every 100,000 years. Most of them are caused by changes in our orbit. The further away from the sun we go, the colder it gets. At the height of the last ice age, ice sheets covered around a third of the planet, and all of this would have been buried under hundreds of feet of ice. But factors like orbit and rotation aren't enough to explain ice stretching right down to the equator. That must have taken something far more dramatic. The smoking gun turned out to be our atmosphere. Specifically, greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide.
A greenhouse gas is any kind of gas which has the capacity to convert the sun's rays into heat, making this planet the warm planet that it is today.
But it's a delicate balancing act. If CO2 levels grow too high or too low, the climate spirals into chaos. Too much carbon dioxide and the planet warms, too little and it cools.
Carbon dioxide is a very important gas. It's both our dilemma and our solution when it's there in too great a proportion that overheats the Earth. which of course we're worried about today. However, in the time leading up to Snowball Earth, we had the opposite problem. There wasn't enough carbon dioxide, and the Earth began to cool to a point where there was a runaway refrigeration that locked this Earth up in an icy crust.
Gehling believes that a drop in carbon dioxide levels caused the Snowball Earth disaster. Something was removing the CO2 from the atmosphere on a huge scale. And there's only one process capable of doing that: weathering. Carbon dioxide mixes with water vapour to form acid rain. The acid reacts with the rocks it falls on to form new carbon chemicals in the water. It then washes down to the sea, where it helps form solid limestone. Carbon dioxide that was once in the atmosphere is locked away on the ocean floor.
When weathering occurs at a great rate, you strip away rocks with acid rain, and that takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and makes sure that it's locked away in the ocean.
Weathering happens more quickly when it's hot and humid. Normally, at least some of the Earth's land masses are too far north or south for weathering to be a major factor. But 650 million years ago, all the Earth's land masses, from Death Valley to Australia, were clumped together into one big supercontinent at the equator. The weathering process went into overdrive. CO2 levels crashed, and so did the Earth's temperature.
You have carbon dioxide being taken out and not replaced, and as a result, the Earth inevitably has to cool until you have a snowball.
Today, plants and animals help balance the levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Plants absorb it, animals breathe it out. But 650 million years ago, the only life forms on Earth were single-celled bacteria in the oceans. And they were actually making the situation worse.
650 million years ago, this is a world of cyanobacteria. Bacteria that formed a slime layer on the seafloor. Cyanobacteria are tiny organisms that have been around on this planet for 3 billion years before Snowball Earth. But at this time, they were particularly important.
These cyanobacteria sucked even more carbon dioxide from the oceans and locked it into limestone reefs called stromatolites. Some of this ancient carbon dioxide is still trapped in fossilised reefs, like these in Flinders Ranges in southern Australia. When Jim Gehling pours a weak acid onto them, the carbon dioxide they locked away hundreds of millions of years ago fizzes out.
What you'll see is an effervescence. Those white bubbles are carbon dioxide that had been locked up in these stromatolites, being released back into the atmosphere.
Rather than stabilising the carbon dioxide levels, the cyanobacteria were depleting them further. In combination with weathering, they sucked the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and temperatures plummeted. Even then, the planet might have avoided a total freeze, until a catastrophic chain reaction pushed it to the point of no return. "30 seconds past 8:27 p.m. on our clock of Earth's history. Snowball Earth, 650 million years ago, and counting. Ice was creeping down from the poles. In a normal ice age, at some point it would have stopped, but this wasn't normal. The ice just kept on coming until eventually it reached a point of no return. As it did, it triggered a phenomenon that would push life to the limit. The Earth's surface is made up of land, open ocean and ice. These surfaces all reflect sunlight differently, and that's the key to what happened next. This is the Arctic Ocean, at the point where the ice meets open water. Scientists call it the lead edge. And geophysicist Don Perovich is here to study how the ancient Earth tipped over into a catastrophic deep freeze.
This is the place where the ice that's frozen to the shore meets the open Arctic Ocean. But it's more than that. The lead is where there's water, the lead's where there's light, and so the lead's where there's life. We see whales going by and seals and birds flying above. It's an incredibly productive area.
Here, Perovich can compare the reflectivity, or albedo, of two very different surfaces, the sea ice and open ocean. His sensor measures the amount of sunlight hitting the ice and the amount it reflects back. Sea ice is the most reflective surface on the planet. It reflects 85% of the sunlight that hits it.
If we were to just go out there, just 100 yards away to the lead, the albedo would be less than 10%. And what's interesting about this is this snow-covered ice has the largest albedo of any naturally occurring surface on Earth, and the open ocean has the smallest. So right here, we have a contrast between the best natural reflector and the worst natural reflector.
Open sea reflects very little light back into space. It absorbs the energy in the sunlight, keeping the planet warm. 650 million years ago, the opposite happened. Earth's best reflector, sea ice, was replacing its worst reflector, sea water. When enough ice had formed, the remaining ocean couldn't absorb enough heat. So more sea ice built up. That reflected more sunlight, the Earth got colder, and that made still more ice. It was the point of no return.
Let's say we grow a little bit more ice. So we're replacing the worst reflector with the best reflector. We'll cool things off, we'll get more ice, and we'll cool it off more, and it builds upon itself.
A runaway freezing effect capable of turning the whole planet into an ice ball. It's an idea no one even considered until a few decades ago. Scientists only discovered it was possible when they were studying another kind of disaster altogether. A nuclear war. During the Cold War, researchers predicted that a nuclear holocaust could push enough smoke and dust into the atmosphere to block out the sun and initiate a global freeze. Russian climate modeler Mikhail Budiko was investigating this scenario when he made a chilling discovery. He calculated that if the ice sheets spread beyond 30 degrees latitude, that's as far south as North Africa, they'd reflect so much of the sun's energy that the Earth would reach an irreversible tipping point.
So when we have a system like the Earth with these feedbacks, one of the things that's talked about a lot is tipping points. You can think of it as you're in a boat rocking back and forth, not much changes until you go too far, and then you're in a new state. And Budiko's work said that if we move the ice down far enough, we'd reach a tipping point and cover the whole Earth with it.
Budiko calculated that if the ice ever reached this tipping point, the planet would no longer absorb enough heat to keep the ice in check. The planet would be entombed in ice from pole to pole. The theory is that 650 million years ago, this was exactly what happened.
Instead of the world we have today, we'd have something that looked like this. A vast expanse of white, of blocks of ice tilted every which way, covered by snow.
The planet descended into the most extreme and least hospitable climate it had ever experienced. Eventually, the ice sheets collided, clamping their icy jaws shut at the equator. It seemed that nothing could survive in this frozen wasteland. And yet, incredibly, it was this catastrophe that brought about life as we know it, and without it, none of this and none of the people around us would be here today. 647 million years ago, 8:28 p.m. on our clock representing the Earth's history. The planet was buried under ice thousands of meters thick. Deep beneath the ice sheets, single-celled organisms, the only life on the planet, faced a stark choice: adapt or die. Bacteria that had evolved over 2 billion years seemed destined for extinction. Imagine if Snowball Earth happened today. Could we survive? Temperatures would plummet way below zero, ice caps would spread out from the poles and engulf whole continents, violent snowstorms would paralyze entire populations.
You could not run a nuclear power plant long enough to get through the Snowball.
Many experts believe we could find ways to live through a short-term ice age, but the odds of surviving a Snowball Earth are next to nothing.
If humans ever experience a Snowball Earth, we will quite bluntly be out of control. There is no way we could stop it. It would be easier to live on the surface of Mars, probably, than on the surface of Earth during a snowball.
Without food to eat or fuel to keep us warm, the ice covering the planet would become our tombstone. During Snowball Earth, the only living things were single-cell bacteria. Even their survival seemed improbable. But here we are. Life clearly did survive. The question is, how? The quest to learn how ancient organisms kept evolution alive has brought this lone microbiologist to Whiteout Glacier in southern Alaska. Here, Hazel Barton studies how life could have survived a global deep freeze. Her mission is to find signs of life in some very dead-looking frozen caves.
People used to think that caves were devoid of life, that there was nothing in there. But it turns out they're actually teeming with microorganisms.
Barton's searching for modern-day microbes living in this ice cave to learn how their ancient ancestors endured the Ice Age 650 million years ago.
If you look on the edge of the cave, you can see all the particle dust that's got lodged in the ice. And it creates a surface that the microbes can actually live on.
The cave runs beneath the glacier. Inside, it's 4 degrees below zero. Creatures that live in such harsh conditions are known as extremophiles. Barton takes samples of the microbes buried in freezing rock sediments at the base of the glacier.
I'm looking for some sediments that might contain microbes that have never been exposed to the heat. So the thing we remember about these bugs is that they love the cold, and they've actually evolved to live in those cold conditions. And because of that, if I was to take them outside right now into the heat of the sunlight, they die. It would be like taking us into the middle of the desert and dropping us off there.
Barton believes this dark sub-zero cave can shed light on how microbes adapted to conditions during Snowball Earth.
The majority of surfaces exposed on Earth would probably have looked something like this. So we're looking at the kind of conditions that organisms that survived that period would have been living on.
They're not just living on the ice, they're living in it too. Sunlight penetrates a few meters into the ice wall, and that's enough for the microbes to flourish.
We're still pretty close to the entrance right here, so I think there's definitely a lot of sunlight energy and enough for cyanobacteria to grow on. And they're probably in the ice. They're living in the ice right now.
The deeper Barton goes into the cave, the darker and colder it gets. But even here, life hangs on.
This is a community that looks like cyanobacteria. They're incredibly resistant to all kinds of stress that you would put them under. They can survive it.
During Snowball Earth, the ice was thousands of meters thick. Enough to block out nearly all the sunlight microbes needed to stay alive. Barton finds similar conditions even deeper into the cave. Here, there's hardly any light at all. But even in this dim, icy world, she finds microbes thriving.
So what we're looking at are microorganisms that have to adapt and generate energy when there is no sunlight. So what they do is they pull energy from the rock itself. They actually chew into the rock to get that energy.
Outside, Barton examines her samples on a field microscope. She believes these modern cyanobacteria have a similar structure to the ancient microbes that survived the Snowball Earth.
We're seeing cyanobacteria. There's a whole community living in that ice. Cyanobacteria really are these amazing organisms. They're very, very adaptive. They're one of the most ancient forms of life on our planet. They can survive some really extreme conditions.
Cyanobacteria have evolved amazing survival mechanisms. If our cells freeze, they burst their walls. If they dry out, they die. But cyanobacteria have evolved a cell structure that prevents rupturing in some of the most extreme conditions on Earth.
They've changed the structure of their DNA so it doesn't get damaged. If you were to take us and dry us, then, our DNA would be irreparable. You do that to a cyanobacteria and you just have to add water 100 years later, and within a few hours, it's starting to carry out photosynthesis again.
Just as some could cope with dry conditions, others could cope with ice. As the ice rolled over them, most microbes died, but the hardiest survived. Over time, strains evolved that thrived in the cold and dark, to become the ancestors of every living thing on Earth today.
Everybody thinks about these global catastrophes like it's going to wipe out all life. And it's like, no, these microorganisms have been going through similar things for billions of years. And they're adaptive and they change. And then they fill the niche that's left behind.
Barton's research proves that even in the most extreme conditions, in the ice, in the dark, life finds a way.
Short of an object the size of Mars hitting the planet, life will go on Earth. And events that we may think are, catastrophic, just simply turn over a new leaf and we start seeing a different form of life on Earth.
The only reason we're here today is because life adapted and survived. But there's another puzzle. We're here, but the ice isn't. All that ice should have kept the planet so cool that it could never thaw again. And for 25 million years it did. Then something extraordinary happened. 8:35 p.m. on our clock of Earth's history. The planet's surface had been locked in ice for almost 25 million years. But at 8:37, a remarkable thing happened. The ice sheets started to recede. Something was warming the Earth. But it wasn't the sun. Believe it or not, the thing that would save the planet was actually inside the Earth itself, buried deep below the ice. This is Mount Augustine in the Aleutian Islands, one of the most volcanic regions on the planet. Augustine has been active for over 40,000 years, and it's still erupting today. Volcanologist John Power is here to study what it tells us about the end of Snowball Earth. Because volcanoes are the only things on the planet hot enough and strong enough to thaw a frozen world.
We're on our way to Augustine Volcano. It's one of the most active volcanoes in the region. Last erupted in 2006. It all comes to play here at Augustine.
A fiery hell lies under Mount Augustine's frozen surface. During its last eruption, millions of tons of lava and ash exploded into the atmosphere. So much material spewed out, the volcano actually grew.
We're about 100 feet higher than the summit of the volcano was prior to the eruption. This is some of the newest land in North America.
Power uses a field thermometer to take a reading from just below the surface.
We've got a temperature of about 95, 96 degrees centigrade. So the summit of the volcano is still very hot. If you wanted to cook some potatoes, fry up some eggs, this would be exactly the spot to do it.
There's no doubt Mount Augustine is hot, but it's hard to believe a volcano, even one this powerful, could punch through an ice sheet several thousand meters thick.
Where we are now has been covered with glacial ice as recently probably as 10, 15, 20,000 years ago. This was all underneath a glacier at that point in time.
When Power examined volcanic rocks here, he found evidence that 24,000 years ago, an eruption smashed its way up through the ice.
There is absolutely no problem for a volcano like Augustine or its neighbors to erupt through an ice sheet that could be either several kilometers or several miles thick.
We know it's possible because we've seen it happen. In 1996, the Grímsvötn volcano in Iceland erupted right through a glacier. It punched its way up to the surface through a kilometre of ice. The torrents of hot gases and ash blew a giant hole in the glacier. It melted ice at a furious rate. Flash floods carrying 45,000 tons of water a second raged for hours. But on a global scale, that's nothing. When the whole world was frozen, a few little holes wouldn't have made much difference. Luckily, volcanoes have another formidable weapon in their arsenal. They spew out more than just lava and rocks. They also produce huge amounts of greenhouse gases.
Carbon dioxide is one of the very dominant species of gas that is coming out of volcanoes. There have been times when we've had certainly, thousands of tons per day coming out of this volcano.
Mount Augustine is dwarfed by the volcanoes that broke through the ice of Snowball Earth. Scientists believe that thousands of them ejected billions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Over a period of around 1 million years, this caused carbon dioxide levels to rise, reversing the depletion that created Snowball Earth and tipping the balance in the opposite direction.
Carbon dioxide rapidly built up in the atmosphere until it got to a critical point where we had a super meltdown of the ice, and that was the death knell of Snowball Earth.
The carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere trapped the sunlight, increased temperatures, and finally melted the ice. After a 25 million year freeze, Snowball Earth was over. As the ice sheets retreated, something remarkable happened. The greatest leap in the evolution of life the world has ever seen. A leap that would lead directly to us. In the oceans, a few single-celled organisms had survived. After the ice melted away, they began to change dramatically. Roughly 3 million years after Snowball Earth ended, the new warm climate triggered an evolutionary explosion unlike any other. Single-celled bacteria evolved into multi-celled creatures. The first ever complex organisms and the ancestors of all animals, including us. It was the dawn of a new era for life on Earth.
Snowball Earth must have been the closest thing to extinction of early life on Earth that we had. And yet we know creatures survived. And it can't be a coincidence that very soon after the waning stages of this Earth-wide ice age, we get the first large creatures. It really seems as though that series of environmental catastrophes spawned the kind of biology that could give rise to multicellularity.
The key to this evolutionary revolution was oxygen. Before the deep freeze, oxygen levels were only 1%, too low to support more complex organisms. After the freeze, levels rocketed to 21%. Scientists suggest the boost in oxygen levels was the result of Ice Age chemistry. During Snowball Earth, the sun's ultraviolet rays reacted with water molecules in the ice to produce a chemical called hydrogen peroxide. When the ice eventually melted, the hydrogen peroxide broke down again, releasing huge quantities of oxygen into the air and oceans. The surge in oxygen levels provided the fuel for life to evolve from single to multi-celled organisms. They don't look like much. They're only the size of pinheads. But these tiny creatures are the oldest multicellular fossils on the planet. The first links in the evolutionary chain that eventually led to advanced animals and humans. In the new oxygen-rich atmosphere, these creatures became more and more complex, from just a few cells bound together to creatures large enough for separate groups of cells to assume different body functions. Over millions of years, these specialized groups of cells evolved into the first organs, and that paved the way for ever larger and more complex anatomies. In Australia, Jim Gayling studies the fossil remains of the creatures that inherited the planet after Snowball Earth.
After Snowball Earth, we see a revolution in the history of life from the fossil record, because for the first time, we see large creatures, creatures that anyone can see with the naked eye. They're the first animals on Earth.
This primitive sea creature is one of the first complex multicellular organisms. It lived and died around 50 million years after the end of Snowball Earth.
It's absolutely complete. You can see the gut, you can see the head end where the segments wrapped around it, and these incredibly fine segments just wrapped over the sea floor.
All the animals on the planet, including us, are descended from creatures like this.
You're looking at the first life forms which had patterns of cells and body plans that were the same as ours. Head, a tail, a belly, a back. Even though they're not necessarily our direct ancestors, these are the first creatures that represent the line of biology that gave rise to us.
All over the planet, similar organisms were evolving, making the leap from primitive to complex life.
There'd been life on this planet for more than 3 billion years. And it was really only the Snowball event that kick-started complex life. If it hadn't been for this ice age, this would have been slime world forever, and we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. So if you want to put your finger on one point in the history of life that made a big difference, that was Snowball Earth.
From slime to this, complex life in all its vivid, colourful, infinite glory. All of this, you, me, every living thing on the planet, is here because of an evolutionary explosion 650 million years ago, of a catastrophic deep freeze that threatened to wipe all life off the Earth, but ended up creating life as we know it. If it wasn't for Snowball Earth, we probably wouldn't be here. 10:40 p.m. on our clock, that's 250 million years ago, once again, every living thing faced extinction. It's a period in prehistory called the Permian, and the Earth faced the biggest catastrophe it had ever seen. One cataclysmic event kick-started a chain reaction that wiped out 95% of all the animal and plant species on the planet. It was Earth's darkest hour, according to scientists like South African paleontologist Roger Smith.
The end Permian extinction was as dramatic as a mass extinction could be. Since the beginning of life on Earth, there has been no other one that has come close to the 95% of species on Earth, both in land and sea, disappearing within a very short space of time.
It was the worst mass extinction ever. But without it, the world we recognise today wouldn't exist.
Had it not been for those few survivors, those few animals which were pre-adapted or able to get through that great drought, we would not have had life on Earth.
How it happened, why it happened, it's a mystery that's puzzled scientists since evidence of the catastrophe was first discovered almost half a century ago. If they could solve it, it could shed new light on our understanding of the evolution of life on Earth. In South Africa, 3 hours' drive from Bloemfontein, Roger Smith is visiting an area that was once teeming with animals.
We're here in the Karoo Basin of South Africa, and it's a vast semi-arid scrubland, lots of canyons, lots of koppies, these flat-topped koppies. But 250 million years ago, this would have looked a very different place. Rainfall in the mountain areas were feeding Mississippi-sized rivers which meandered themselves slowly across the plains. This was a fully developed, stable ecosystem.
Small plant-eating creatures called dictodonts thrived here, scurrying about in the vegetation. Huge herds of cow-sized herbivores called dicynodonts grazed on the plains. But this flourishing world was also home to a vicious killer. Over 150 million years before T-Rex came along, Gorgonopsian was the Earth's most efficient carnivore. Armed with serrated interlocking teeth, this ferocious animal was the ancient world's top predator. But all these creatures were doomed. None of them survived the mass extinction. An event so devastating, so total, life itself was nearly wiped out. Its cause would be a mystery. If it wasn't for clues buried in the rocks, like those of South Africa's Karoo Basin. Under this scrub, paleontologists have unearthed rocks from this turbulent time.
My job as a geologist and a paleontologist is to read the rocks and to understand how they were laid down and to understand what happened to life through the ages. Now, sedimentary rocks like this are characterized by layers, each layer representing a point in time when deposition was taking place. The oldest layers are at the bottom and the youngest layers at the top.
These rocks are like a time machine, taking us back 250 million years. As Smith climbs the rocks, he reaches the layer that records the moment the Permian world was wiped out.
Here we're sitting at the very top of the Permian, and this particular interval shows us something very dramatic in the rock record. Below me we have green and bluish-grey rocks that clearly suggest that the environment was wet.
These rocks testify to the near death of our planet. The grey and green rocks were formed by flooding, and they're littered with fossils. They tell us that this part of the world was once wet, lush, and full of life. But just above this layer, it's a very different story.
Suddenly everything turns red, and that reddening is an indication of drying, rapid drying and warming.
These red rocks reveal a sudden and dramatic rise in temperature and mark the point in time when life on Earth very nearly came to an end.
The fossils tell us at this point there is virtually nothing left on Earth and we go into a dead zone.
This layer marks the moment when the world changed. Below the line, grey rocks full of fossils, full of life. Above, in the red rocks, nothing. Life had almost ceased to exist. And not just here. The dead zone was a line of death that travelled all around the world and could be found on every continent. This meant that global warming and mass extinction were global. 250 million years ago, the Earth's temperature spiraled out of control. Something huge on a planet-wide scale pushed temperatures up by 10 degrees and killed virtually all life on Earth. It's 10:40 on our clock of the Earth's history. 250 million years ago, our planet was in climate freefall. The sudden and dramatic global warming changed the course of evolution on Earth. It caused a mass extinction so devastating that scientists thought it must have been caused by something extraordinary. An impact from outer space. Could it have been an asteroid strike? An impact would have sent billions of tons of dust high into the atmosphere. blocking out the sun, stopping plant growth, reducing temperatures, and causing the food chain to collapse. The extinction would have happened within days, weeks, but that's not the story the rocks are telling us. Over the last decade, Professor Paul Wignall and researchers at Leeds University have been examining rocks from the dead zone around the time of the devastating mass extinction. They've collected thousands of samples and taken hours of video on their expeditions to Greenland. These rocks paint a more complete picture of the extinction than the rocks from South Africa, revealing a story of extinction on land and sea.
The extinction is like the biggest fossil crime scene of all time, and so the great thing about Greenland is that we have such a great record at the crime scene, if you like. There's just a huge amount of information to be collected. So it provides us with an extremely detailed record of what happened, probably one of the best records of that time interval.
What's more, these Greenland rocks put paid to the idea that an impact caused the extinction.
One of the most obvious clues would be that the extinction should occur extremely fast, within sort of days and weeks of an impact. Everything will essentially drop dead in a matter of years. And so that should be razor sharp when we see it in a fossil record. We should see just an abrupt line or termination, and that's not what we see.
Instead, Wignall's rocks show that the extinction happened over a period of 100,000 years. Far too long to be the result of a meteor strike. The Greenland team's discovery meant that something else must have caused the catastrophic extinction. And geologist Mike Benton thinks he knows what. He believes the disaster began deep beneath the Earth's surface.
If it's not impact, then the next most obvious, dramatic, instant kind of catastrophe is initiated by volcanic eruptions of some kind. So you obviously look for some center of volcanic eruptions.
Volcanoes and nature's ultimate destructive force. Fueled by immense pressure deep within the planet, they shoot molten rock and toxic gases high into our atmosphere. If scientists could find evidence of intense volcanic activity taking place just before the mass extinction, then it could be the smoking gun they'd been looking for. Deep beneath the frozen wastes of one of the remotest corners of the Earth, Siberia, is a major clue. A vast expanse of ancient lava flows, forming a bleak landscape called the Siberian Traps.
The Siberian Traps are a style of volcanism which we don't see on Earth today. They represent the biggest style of volcanism that the Earth ever experiences or produces.
Earth's ancient volcanic eruptions dwarf anything we might witness today. At the end of the Permian period, millions of cubic miles of magma built up beneath the Siberian crust. The entire region began to bulge upwards. And then, like a giant blister, the Earth erupted, spewing out vast amounts of lava, flooding the area under a sea of molten rock. It's a type of volcanic eruption called a flood basalt. Here was the force behind the extermination. 250 million years ago, the Siberian flood basalt released enough lava to cover an area the size of the United States under 1 mile of molten rock. Siberia has long since cooled, but Iceland is still one of the world's most geologically active places. Here, Mike Benton is researching the terrible impact even a small flood basalt could have.
We're here in the middle of a lava field in Laki in Iceland, because this is a very well-documented historical basalt eruption that can act as a good analogy for the Siberian traps. In 1783, a vent eruption happened here which lasted for about 8 months.
This 18th century incident offers a unique insight into a flood basalt's devastating power. Over 8 months, the Laki event ravaged southern Iceland. But it was tiny compared to the Siberian eruptions. Even so, it was a disaster.
Volcanoes produce 3 things. The lava is one, that will kill things locally, but it produces ash and, most importantly, gas. Now, the lava goes a relatively short distance, the ash will go further, flying through the air, but what really kills are the gases.
The Laki eruption produced huge quantities of sulfur dioxide, a gas which has a deadly impact on the environment. Mixing it with water creates sulfuric acid, which falls to Earth as acid rain.
That has a terrible effect, as was recorded by the people at Laki, where they reported that it burned people's eyeballs, it made it hard for them to breathe because it congested their lungs. Livestock suffered lesions and burning of their skin, and plants were killed off.
The whole food chain began to collapse. And that was just the start. Some of the sulfuric acid didn't fall back to Earth. It stayed in the atmosphere in small droplets. These reflected sunlight away from the planet, cooling its surface.
The cooling following the Laki eruption was catastrophic. It killed more people than the immediate damage by sulfuric acid. It created very cold winters for 2 or 3 years after the eruption. Not just on Iceland, but throughout much of northern Europe, people reported crop failures and death as a result.
Benton's analysis of the Laki eruption has shown that the cooling effect produced by volcanic sulfur dioxide is deadly. And that the effects can be felt thousands of miles away. Imagine how devastating the Siberian traps must have been. Laki spewed out gas and lava for 8 months and covered an area of about 200 square miles in molten rock. But the Siberian traps erupted for nearly 500,000 years. They produced almost 3 million square miles of lava. That's 200,000 times larger than Laki. Using Laki as a model, Benton can begin to reconstruct the chain of events that turned the Siberian eruptions into a global killer. It started with a huge eruption.
The most likely sequence of events starts with these massive eruptions in Siberia, with lava spreading over thousands of square kilometers, square miles of landscape, and causing destruction and devastation wherever they went.
Then came the real killer. Like Laki, the eruptions released billions of tons of sulfur dioxide into Earth's atmosphere. First, it turned into acid rain and bleached vast areas of the Earth. Then it created volcanic winters, which sent global temperatures plummeting. Around the world, the climate change killed plants, and the food chain fell apart. Where the plants failed, herbivores like Dicynodonts starved. And where they starved, the carnivores that ate them died too. 10% of species perished. But this was just the beginning. Another gas released by the Siberian traps was about to make things much, much worse. In Leeds, paleontologist Paul Wignall is surrounded by the victims. Fossils found in rocks from Greenland. They testify to the devastating effects of the Siberian eruptions.
The first things that start suffering in the entire fossil record is the plant record. We start seeing a change in the composition of plants. And also we start to see the appearance of some very strange mutated spores.
Wignall's fossilised plants reveal a world struggling to adapt to climate change. They also record the effects of a second deadly volcanic gas. Carbon dioxide.
Looking at the surfaces of leaves and the number of little holes that are in the surfaces of leaves is actually a monitor of how much carbon dioxide there is.
Plants need carbon dioxide to survive. They absorb it through tiny holes on the backs of their leaves. The more carbon dioxide there is in the environment, the fewer holes the plant needs to absorb it. When scientists studied fossilised leaves dating back 250 million years, they discovered a sudden dramatic reduction in the number of breathing holes. It seemed that at the start of the extinction, levels of carbon dioxide surged. And that meant one thing. The Siberian trap eruptions must have released billions of tons of CO2. Scientists calculate that the amount of carbon dioxide in Earth's atmosphere at the time of the eruptions was 20 times higher than it is today. More than enough to seriously affect the climate. It was global warming gone mad.
The result of these Siberian trap eruptions was a rise in global temperature of at least 5 degrees centigrade. And they happened episodically, so that it may be there were pulses repeated and repeated of temperature rise.
5 degrees may sound small to us, but it had a massive impact on the Earth's climate. Warming the Earth's atmosphere affects how rain is generated and dictates where it falls. By raising the Earth's temperature, volcanic CO2 fundamentally altered global weather systems. In equatorial regions, it simply stopped raining. In South Africa, the Karoo Basin felt the full impact of this change in climate. Its lush floodplains became a scorched desert. Paleontologist Roger Smith studies how this rapidly changing landscape affected the Karoo's inhabitants. And he's just discovered one of the victims.
Here we have an in situ skull of Dicynodon. It's one of the last of the big cow-sized herbivores of the Permian period. And at this level, which is just below the extinction, this represents probably the last gasp of the Permian herbivores.
Global warming marked an evolutionary watershed in the Earth's history. Animals and plants suffered from drought and starvation. 35% of them perished. But the fallout from the Siberian traps was only just beginning. The rise in global temperatures triggered a domino effect that unleashed the next terrible wave of extinction, this time in the oceans. It's 10:40 p.m. on the Earth's clock, 250 million years ago. Massive volcanic eruptions released millions of tons of gas that first cooled, then heated the ancient world. This seesawing climate killed animals and plants by the million. Extinction ruled the land. This was the terrible first phase in the extermination of virtually all life on Earth, but a critical moment in the story of man's evolution. So far, the oceans had escaped unscathed. But that was about to change. Paleontologist Paul Wignall has found evidence of the next deadly phase of the mass extinction, 50,000 years after the start of the Siberian eruptions. The death of the oceans.
This is a really nice example of rocks that we get from Greenland. The evidence is, first of all, they're very black, which is typical when you have no oxygen around. But even more telltale is these lovely sort of golden crystals, which we can see on the surface. And this is pyrite, or fool's gold. And we'd only find this if there was no oxygen around on the sea floor.
It's an important breakthrough. Fool's gold can only form in an environment that lacks oxygen. Its discovery in 250-million-year-old rocks means only one thing. Somehow, the Earth's oceans had lost their oxygen.
It was clear that there was something major going on which hadn't been discovered before. What we could see was a sudden lack of oxygen at the end Permian mass extinction. It's a completely new extinction phenomenon. It's then that we realised that we were now looking at a very different way of killing life in the seas.
But even lower oxygen levels in the water can't explain why so many different species died. It's a mystery that research at Green Lakes National Park in upstate New York has helped to solve. Marine geologist Lee Kump has discovered the process that he thinks was responsible for the wipeout of nearly all marine life 250 million years ago.
We're here at Green Lake because we view this as a microcosm of the ocean that may have existed at the end of the Permian at the time of this great mass extinction. It's a really unique habitat here that's unusual in terms of most lakes. It's like a typical lake at the surface, but lurking down below is this poisonous water.
The lake looks normal, but under the surface it's dying. Just like the ancient Permian oceans. The water's stagnating, its circulation grinding to a halt. Over the past 5 years, Kump and divers from Penn State University have been monitoring the lake's slow death. At the bottom, they've found strange colonies of purple sulfur bacteria, an organism that only lives in water rich in a highly toxic gas called hydrogen sulfide. And this gas is a vital ingredient in the production of fool's gold, discovered in Greenland rocks from the sea floor 250 million years ago. It seems whatever is happening in this lake was happening in the Permian oceans.
Once the oxygen level drops, then to the point where there's no oxygen left, then organisms that can't stand oxygen begin to thrive. And these organisms have a waste product, hydrogen sulfide, that is poisonous to air-breathing life.
Kump and his team are researching the rising levels of hydrogen sulfide in the lake. They do this by measuring the growth of purple sulfur bacteria, recording the changing depth at which it can be found. They know when they found it when they pull out pink water.
We're looking for the pink water because that's indicative of where these purple sulfur bacteria live. So this is our marker of where these organisms have a very large population density. There are so many there that they create this pink water.
Below this toxic layer of pink water, oxygen-breathing animals can't survive. Kumps charted the changing depths at which pink water can be found in Green Lake.
Ready?
Ready. Whew. Oh, yeah, that's rotten eggs. That's nasty stuff.
He's discovered that as oxygen levels in the lake drop, the amount of poisonous hydrogen sulfide increases and pink water can be found closer to the surface. It means the poison is rising up through the water, killing all the oxygen-breathing animals who live there. The Green Lakes are just a few small pockets of water, but imagine it on a global scale.
If we were to take a satellite picture of the Permian Ocean, the regions that are green today would have been pink when viewed from space because of the abundance of the purple sulfur bacteria.
Kumps Green Lakes research gives us an insight into what was happening in the world's oceans at the time of the mass extinction. Rocks from the same period tell us it was a global phenomenon. Oceans and seas were starved of oxygen and saturated with poison. Something major must have happened to trigger the removal of oxygen. In Green Lake, it's caused by stagnating water. The water has stopped circulating. And recently, researchers have discovered that 250 million years ago, the same thing happened on a global scale. Normally, oxygen dissolves into seawater at the surface. It's then transported by currents circulating between the equator and the poles. Sunlight at the equator warms the seawater. As this warm water moves towards the poles, it cools and sinks, carrying its dissolved oxygen down with it, allowing the oceans and its inhabitants to breathe. This same process was happening 250 million years ago. But then, the Siberian traps came along and raised Earth's temperature by 5 degrees centigrade.
The significance of that for the world as a whole, and particularly the oceans, is the way it affects circulation in the world's oceans. It's a bit like leaving a goldfish bowl in the window in bright sunshine. The water there, it warms up, it loses its oxygen, and it essentially stagnates. And so if you magnify that to an oceanic scale, then that's effectively what we think is happening in the oceans at the end of the Permian.
The evidence suggests that 250 million years ago, the rapid global warming created by volcanic gases warmed not only the atmosphere, it warmed the oceans. They stopped circulating oxygen and stagnated, becoming breeding grounds for poisonous hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria.
The warming then led to the development of the buildup of hydrogen sulfide in the deep ocean. This built up to such large concentrations that it invaded into the shallow part of the ocean and displaced all of the air-breathing organisms from those environments and eventually provided them no place of shelter.
Climate change triggered by the Siberian traps had already killed around 1/3 of all species on land. By raising the temperature of Earth's oceans, it then caused the death of virtually all life in the sea. But the killing wasn't finished. Lurking at the bottom of the oceans was another killer, one that would wipe out practically everything else on Earth. In Iceland, geologist Mike Benton is searching for clues to this final deadly wave of extinctions.
There is a mystery to understand how the production of carbon dioxide and the sudden rise in global temperature of about 5 degrees could have caused such a catastrophic event. A sudden rise in global temperature of about 5 degrees wouldn't in itself kill life in the catastrophic way we see. Something else must have caused that massive scale of extinction that we know happened that time.
The gases released from the Siberian traps triggered global warming that wiped out species first on the land, then in the oceans. But then temperatures increased again by another 5 degrees. The result, a catastrophic second wave of extinction on the land. Scientists know that carbon dioxide released by the traps caused the first leap in global temperatures, but the second jump remained a puzzle. They needed to find something even stronger than CO2 that could have accelerated global warming on an unprecedented scale. And they found the answer to this mystery hidden in the depths of the ocean off the coast of Santa Barbara, California. About a mile offshore, Dr. Ira Leifer, a climatologist from the University of California, is on his way to monitor an unusual phenomenon. He's looking for another greenhouse gas, not carbon dioxide, but methane.
This area is where methane from deep within the Earth rises through the Earth's crust until it reaches the seabed, and then through the water column to reach the sea surface as bubbles.
You can find these bubble seeps in coastal areas all over the planet. But this one's proximity to Southern California has given scientists a unique opportunity to monitor one closely. In the cold North Pacific water, students from the university dive to the source of the seepage. They're going to gather samples of the gas as it escapes from the sea floor.
Methane is a very potent greenhouse gas, perhaps 20 to 25 times more potent on a molecule per molecule basis than CO2. That means if we add 1 molecule of CO2 to the atmosphere and 1 molecule of methane, that methane has 25 times the effect.
The amount of methane released by seeps like this one in Santa Barbara is too small to explain the additional 5-degree temperature rise recorded towards the end of the mass extinction. But there is another source of the gas that might. In the deep ocean, the most unexplored and least understood part of our world, lie vast quantities of a substance called methane hydrate. It's methane gas frozen in the cold water at the bottom of the sea. Today, there's an estimated 30 trillion tons of methane locked away in ice on the seabed. If it turned into gas, there'd be a global disaster. Ira Leifer thinks that this may be exactly what happened 250 million years ago.
If we look at this massive extinction as comparable to a genocidal crime on an unimaginable scale, and we ask ourselves, who are the criminal suspects? Who's responsible? We'd look at the evidence. And at the top of the short list is methane hydrates because of the vast size and their known instability.
Frozen methane is ultra-sensitive to heat. Raising its temperature by even a couple of degrees can destabilize it and trigger the release of this powerful greenhouse gas.
If the atmosphere warms for any particular reason, the ocean will warm, methane hydrate will release methane. This will warm the atmosphere, leading to warmer temperatures and even more methane hydrate in the releasing its methane to the atmosphere. A positive feedback cycle.
250 million years ago, billions of tons of volcanic gases produced by the Siberian traps triggered one of these cycles. The eruptions increased global temperature by 5 degrees. The world warmed up, enough to thaw the frozen methane hydrate at the bottom of the oceans and release billions of tons of potent greenhouse gas into Earth's atmosphere. The temperature went up another 5 degrees. The world was now 10 degrees centigrade hotter. Unable to adapt to the extreme and rapid climate change, 95% of all life ceased to exist. But 5% lived, and those survivors are the ancestors of all life on Earth. "250 million years ago, a vibrant, lush ecosystem teeming with life was rapidly transformed into a barren, desolate world. For the planet's dominant species, there was no hope of survival. The planet had been brought to its knees by savage volcanic eruptions, turning it into a fireball Earth. The eruptions released toxic gases that created worldwide climate chaos and killed almost every living thing.
For something like a Gorgonopsian, it would have seen a world which would be changing. The various animals that it was eating would be becoming rarer. It would be getting a heck of a lot hotter. So terminal times for the Gorgonopsians and all around it as well.
For these fearsome predators, as for most living things, it was the end of the line. But in evolutionary terms, it was a new beginning.
Catastrophes can reset the evolutionary clock. That means that evolution, the whole direction of evolution perhaps will change because the dominant species disappear. And then other species that were taking a less significant role before the event have their chance.
These are cynodonts. They'd been a favourite snack for Gorgonopsians, but by burrowing underground, they'd stayed out of their predators' reach. And it proved to be a useful habit when climate change scorched the Earth's surface. Tubers and roots underground provided them with water and food. In South Africa's Karoo Basin, paleontologist Roger Smith has made a remarkable discovery.
We're looking at a burrow cast in the early Triassic, and we know from fossils that have been found in the ends of these casts that they are cynodont. Cynodonts were digging burrows during the end Permian extinction event. And it's very likely that that was one of the reasons why it was able to survive the Great Drought at that time.
After the mass extinction, these cynodonts went on to become one of the dominant species in the New World. Without them, we wouldn't be here today.
One of the cynodont line eventually became a mammal, and had it not been for the survivor through the cynodont line, mammals would not have existed and evolved, and nor would we. So we have a lot to thank the cynodonts for.
250 million years ago, life suffered a devastating blow and survived, with new species and new ecosystems. But the same kind of catastrophe that gave our earliest ancestors their chance could happen again. Eruptions like the one at Larky happen on average every 20 million years. Really big ones, like the Siberian traps, are rarer. They happen every few 100 million years. But they do happen.
It might shock people to realize that the Earth can cause extreme devastation, and of course there's nothing that human beings with all their technology could do to counter that. So that if there were to be an eruption today on the scale of Siberian traps, it would be hard to know how large numbers of human beings could protect themselves from it. So very likely there would be unbelievable death and destruction. Nobody would be safe.
But the biggest threat to mankind's future might not be a naturally occurring phenomenon. For the first time in history, the dominant species on the Earth is upsetting the delicate balance of its own ecosystem. Our production of carbon dioxide is having a catastrophic impact on Earth's systems.
We have the potential to release 2,000 or 3,000 gigatons of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in the next couple centuries. When we look at the Siberian trap volcanism, we're talking about maybe similar quantities of carbon dioxide released, but over millennia to maybe 1 million years. And so we're taking the whole Siberian trap event and compressing it into the time scale of human activity, 1 or 2 centuries. And that's scary.
It's already causing the planet to heat up. And scientists fear that the runaway global warming of the past could happen again in the future. With more than 30 trillion tons of methane locked up as hydrates on the sea floor, the potential for another hydrate meltdown is as real today as it was 250 million years ago. But this time, we would have started it.
I'm sure if we carry on what we're doing today in terms of pollution, we will cause a catastrophe, but how quickly is the big question.
The end Permian extinction was one of the most important chapters in the story of the evolution of life. It's an incredible thought, but it nearly wiped out life itself from the face of the planet. It ended the reign of the masters of the Earth, but it provided opportunities for others, survivors, who'd become our direct ancestors. Without the mass extinction event, all this probably wouldn't be here at all.